Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Welcome to episode 14 of the Power Trends podcast, where we discuss issues facing the New York power sector and competitive electric markets with the leaders and experts helping shape the grid of the future. I'm your host, Kevin Lanahan, Vice President, External Affairs and Corporate Communications of the NYISO. And in this episode, we welcome back Zach Smith, our Vice President of System and Resource Planning here at the New York ISO. Zach last joined us for episode 4 way back in 2019. That episode, Zach, as I think you know, is one of our most popular. Zach joined the NYISO more than 15 years ago. In his current role, he is chiefly responsible for oversight and implementation of system and transmission planning. Zach, you also oversee the interconnection process, and that's the process through which new generation technologies, including renewable resources, of course, are connecting to the New York State electric grid. That's going to be our focus here today. We might delve into some other topics of interest. So, Zach, first, welcome back. Appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to be back.
Let's first help our listeners out here who may not be totally familiar when we say system planning, transmission opportunities. In simple terms, you're ensuring that the grid, looking out into the future on a general time frame of 10 years, stays reliable. But there's more to it than that. So if you could just give our listeners a quick overview, the large role you play here at the NYISO and what you're thinking about on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, across our entire planning responsibilities, our absolute primary concern is the reliability of the grid. To focus on the reliability of the grid, we look at 10 years out. We go through a biennial planning cycle that also then includes quarterly assessments to look at reliability more near term. It's really important. We have had this reliability process in some form for many years now. And now with the changes to the grid, it's just so much more important, so much more vitally important, because as the system changes, we're encountering all kinds of new challenges to maintain that reliability and to maintain the efficiency of the grid and to see that consumers are getting the best service and most reliable service that can be provided. And, as part of that, we look at the system as a whole. We look at what's changing on the system. We look at what types of issues could drive risks to reliability of the grid. In this past year, not only did we complete our standard reliability needs assessment, but we also conducted a climate change study to assess what are the impacts of some of the really aggressive goals that the state has to meet renewable challenges and climate change challenges, and how that connects in with what we may see in terms of climate events, cold snaps, heat waves, ice storms, those types of things. We're evaluating all of that to make sure that going forward, the reliability and resiliency of the grid is maintained, not just in the near term, but in the long term. And as we assess all of that, it becomes very important to consider that when new resources are coming on the system. So, with all of those public policies, NYISO plays an important role in enabling those resources and making sure that they can interconnect reliably. So, there are new wind farms, there are solar farms, both utility scale and behind the meter. With the wind, there's the land-based wind that's primarily upstate, and then offshore wind that is, of course, primarily downstate New York. All of these present unique challenges, and not only unique challenges to the efficiency of operating the grid and the economics around it, but also to the reliability of the grid. And the way we evaluate that is through our interconnection process. And we have any new resource must go through that interconnection process. We evaluate them for their potential impact to reliability. And we want to make sure that we make that process as efficient as possible.
That was a really good overview. I want to delve deeper into some of the subjects that you just brought up there, including the impact that climate change, you mentioned that you and your group performed, has on the grid. We see more frequent and more extreme weather events here, of course, across the country, but planning for those as well in the Northeast and in New York. Let's take us back 5 years ago, before we get into the interconnection process a little deeper, what the system looked like then.
Absolutely. It's amazing the transformation. I think back 5 years and there were a good number of, coal plants still on the grid. There was relatively little wind. We had a number of wind resources, but still not that many. Solar was basically unheard of. Of course, you had it on rooftops, but in terms of utility scale, I think hardly any. It's quite amazing the transformation that the grid has already started to experience just in these last few years. And it's only going to exponentially change going forward for the next 5, 10, 20 years. So the types of issues we think of in planning the grid, when I think back 5 years, you had all of these fossil fueled resources, which perhaps from a reliability standpoint might be helpful. But of course, there's all kinds of negatives that come along with those. So as the resources change for the good, for the environment and for the climate, we have to then face some of the challenges in terms of engineering the grid and make sure that reliability can be maintained. The shift that we've seen is a very significant increase in wind power. We've seen a good number of those come to fruition and installed on the grid, but we see so many more working their way through our interconnection process, including both land-based and offshore wind. We see a lot of solar. We work very closely with the utilities across the state in evaluating all of those interconnections. And every utility, even on their lower voltage underlying system, they experience all kinds of challenges as well. And we work together with all of them, working towards maintaining reliability.
And of course, in there is also the extreme policy shifts and changes that we've seen certainly over the last 2 years or so with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. That changed the game. About a year or so ago, you and our CEO, Rich Dewey, got together and made a call to the staff, all of the entities that participate in our governance process, and said, we're starting to see major changes showing up in the interconnection process. These renewable assets showing up in greater numbers in our process want to connect to the grid. And so we needed to make a change, and your group needed to shift dramatically in terms of running that process to deal with that influx of resources in a record time, frankly, and did so successfully. So let's start at the beginning. I'd ask you to give us some observations.
The experience we used to have with the interconnection process, we often would see what we referred to as waves of requests, primarily driven by tax credits. Like, if you had a federal tax credit applied to a wind farm, solar farm, something like that, oftentimes there were deadlines associated with that. So we would see waves of requests come through our interconnection process that we would have to address in a timely manner. We didn't want to be the barrier to that. And that always created challenges. You reference the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or CLCPA, and that just creates a tidal wave of requests compared to the waves we've seen in the past. The CLCPA, through its targets, primarily the 70% renewable energy by 2030, and then eventually a emission-free grid by 2040, that's going to require an enormous shift in the resource mix of generation across the New York grid. Of course, it's a great thing, but it also has the potential to overwhelm our interconnection process. And the concern was that the process may not be able to handle so many requests. So, as you referenced, going into this past class year, which is our clustered study, where you put all the requests together that have met certain milestones into one study to evaluate their combined impact on the reliability of the grid. And if those projects together have an impact on the reliability of the grid, well, then we need to figure out what the solution is to that. We have to identify upgrades or modifications to the grid to enable those resources to accommodate them, and then use that analysis to then allocate the costs of those upgrades to those generators that are causing the impact. Going through that process can be very complex. And what makes it even more complex is the more projects you add. So this past class year was easily the largest class year that we've ever seen, and heavily driven by the CLCPA. And, we wanted to make sure that we addressed the process to make sure that that didn't stand in the way of all those resources moving forward. And so through working with Rich, our CEO, my entire team, And across the organization of the NYISO, we identified ways that we could improve upon the process and try to find the fastest way through for various projects. For example, one aspect of the interconnection process is to evaluate whether a project is quote unquote deliverable. And that relates to their ability to participate in our capacity market. And without getting into those level of details, it's an extra set of analysis that's necessary. And in prior class years, that all had to be done at once, at one time, and all the members of a class year had to wait until every single project had resolved all of their issues, including deliverability issues. We now allow those projects that have deliverability issues to kind of split off onto their own process, to not stand in the way of the rest of the class year. And we've already seen great benefits to that. We were able to complete the class year report itself in just over 1 year, which is pretty tremendous given the sheer number of projects that were involved. And then after that study report was completed, we worked through all the iterations associated with cost allocation, and we really did get the class year done in record time. We hope that through lessons learned through that process, that we can improve upon that even further in this new class year that has just begun for class year 2021. And this class year has the potential to be even larger. We don't know the exact numbers yet. We're up for that challenge. We believe we've taken the steps necessary to provide expedited treatment of all of these interconnection requests while making sure that we are not sacrificing the reliability of the grid for the sake of time.
It's not just the volume of projects and proposals that you guys all of a sudden saw increase and have to deal with. It's the complexity of the projects themselves and proximity and the location of these projects on the system that can impact each other in ways that you can't really understand and anticipate until you start to get into the work that you and your team does. So it's almost like moving some chess pieces around the board. It changes the game dramatically. That created that kind of a significant challenge.
That's absolutely right. Just to provide an example, you have geographically limited areas where a lot of these resources can locate. You have to build wind where the wind blows. You have to build utility scale solar where you have sufficient land to build it. And so that drives them to certain locations across New York State and thus drives them to certain points of interconnection on the electric grid. And so very often we find that we have numerous interconnection requests all connecting in roughly the same vicinity. And because they're in the same vicinity, not only might the project individually have some interaction with the grid that needs to be addressed, but then that interaction could be compounded by the existence of multiple projects in that area. And that's precisely the purpose of the class year, is to put them all together into the same model of the electric grid and to evaluate those compounded impacts.
So in anticipation of all of this, you and your team did build in some improvements, some efficiencies. If you just mention in practical terms, what were those to try and get yourself set up for success before you went into this challenging year?
Some of the other changes, though, that we implemented are more like administrative, almost things that may be behind the scenes that are less noticeable sometimes to the customer. That may include study agreements, all of the administrative lift that it takes to actually get into a study. We continue to work on those processes and to streamline them. That bought us quite a bit of time in this past class year. In terms of customer focus, we also created a what we call a queue portal. So anyone who is interacting in the interconnection process, including if they want to get started and put in an interconnection request, they just go to the NYISO website, go to the planning page, and you'd find a big link to the Interconnection Queue portal. And then they set up a user account, get in there, and they can use that to manage everything with their project. We continue to improve upon that tool, that web-based tool for our customers. In the past, it has been entirely through email. So we want to continue to improve on that process and try to provide the best customer experience that we can, and also try to alleviate as many barriers as we can.
Is there anything that you can share, any additional thoughts that you guys have about building in certain efficiencies?
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's going to be any surprise to people what the makeup of the next class year is going to be. It is not finalized yet, so there's no details that I can share at this time. However, There are certain milestones that are necessary in order to make it into the class year, and that includes completing some of the earlier stages of the interconnection process. When you look at the projects that have completed those earlier stages, as I've described, I mean, it's broadly renewables or projects associated with renewables. It continues to be driven by the CLCPA, by those targets, by the policies overall that are driving the need for those resources, and a real desire by developers to put forward solutions to those policies. And so I expect that the class year probably will be larger than the prior class year, but we're ready to handle it from a process standpoint based on everything I've just described. Even despite the pandemic challenges, we worked with our training department at the NYISO to develop an online training course that developers can access. And, it gives them better guidance as to the interconnection process. As streamlined as we make the process and as streamlined as we think it is, there are always going to be questions. My staff is always available and ready to answer any questions that any developer may have. But we thought that maybe a way to gain some efficiency, to gain some time, is to take a little bit extra time last year to develop a training tool. So we developed a frequently asked questions document that people can easily access. And we developed an online training course, a training seminar that any developer is welcome to go in and access.
Yeah, Zach, I think I'll also take the opportunity here to plug that we, with the cooperation and collaboration of your team, are building out these knowledge articles that can help answer a lot of questions for customers instead of picking up the phone and trying to get a hold of an expert or an SME on your team, and putting that information in written form through our Salesforce platform for customers that they can see and digest on their schedule. That should also help with a lot of the challenges that you're talking about there. Let's shift a moment and go back to the climate study that you mentioned at the top of our broadcast. That was a significant effort, one that we and your group hadn't taken on before. If you can explain to us why we took that effort up, what we were looking to discover, help find out. I think it's fair to say that the CLCPA that we keep talking about is a game changer in many respects. And climate just generally has impacted the system in ways we couldn't have anticipated 5-10 years ago. Tell us what you found in that study, what drove us to look at some of the issues inside of that study.
It was a really interesting study, particularly for those of us in the industry, like you said, working on issues, working on topics that we really hadn't focused quite as much on before. It started with considering what would be the impact of cold snaps, what would be the impact of heat waves, ice storms, even rising sea levels, considering that a number of power plants and substations are located on or near bodies of water. And so it was with those risks in mind that we at first embarked on the climate change study, which was intended to be about a 3-year study. The first phase of it was to consider, to what extent does climate change have an impact on consumer demand? So a major part of planning the grid is understanding what is going to be the demand on that grid. What is going to drive consumer demand of electricity? Under summer heat wave conditions, on today's grid, that's where we would typically experience our highest level of demand, or peak load, as we call it. But in the future, that very well could change. In the future, you could move towards greater electrification, and there's a lot of policies around that, where electrification, such as electric vehicles, more electrified heating, could shift the pattern of electric demand and possibly shift it out to New York being a winter peaking system, where we experience our highest demand actually during the winter months rather than during the summer months like we do today. So that was all the focus in the first phase of the study. And while we were developing that first phase, then CLCPA came out. It was a game changer. And so we then took that information and use that to begin the phase 2 of the study, which was looking at the reliability of the grid and primarily focusing about 20 years from now, an emission-free grid in 2040. We wanted to focus on, in terms of maintaining reliability of the grid, what attributes are necessary. We take for granted there are a number of attributes that the resource mix we have today provides, and they have been providing for many decades. So we kind of wanted to take a step back, not take that for granted, and to say, okay, if we find ourselves in an emission-free grid in 2040, what do we do to maintain reliability? And through that analysis, we worked to identify what attributes were necessary. And one of those key attributes that we found, and we had a whole slew of conclusions, but a key conclusion was that you really need a dispatchable resource. We called it a dispatchable emission-free resource. It could be any number of technologies, but the point being is that there are certain attributes that are necessary in order to maintain reliability of the grid. What if the wind ceases to blow, and what if clouds come in and you get less sunshine for some period of time? You still are going to have significant electric demand, and you need resources standing, willing, and ready to produce, sometimes on a moment's notice, in order to provide that power. On today's system, it's typically fossil fueled units. In the future system, there's a number of technologies that could be leveraged, but it's an uphill climb right now. I mean, there's technology challenges that need to get addressed over the next 20 years. It certainly can be doable. Our focus in the climate change study is to identify, well, what criteria do you need to work towards? What specifications do you need of these resources in the future? We really want to provide that guide to stakeholders, to policymakers, to developers, so that they can start developing that technology, getting it commercialized. So it's 20 years from now, we're still comfortable with the reliability of the grid. So it was a very interesting study. We're still working on it. One major aspect of it is to inform market design and what the NYISO can be doing in terms of sending the right market signals to developers to incent the right kind of behavior and investment in the grid, once again, to maintain reliability as we go forward through these years.
Yeah, it's key, that reliability aspect for a careful transition to that carbon-free grid. And you guys are at the heart and the center of that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. And to your earlier point, I'm very proud of the work that we've done in terms of getting information out to the marketplace, out to stakeholders, but primarily out to policymakers. We really want to do everything we can. We think there's lots of challenges ahead for us to continue to help out with. So we stand ready to continue our work. We have a biennial reliability planning process where we conduct a reliability needs assessment. It looks out, it evaluates what we expect to be on the system over that 10-year period from a resource perspective, and also what transmission plans we expect to be completed. And then taking that all into consideration, running a whole suite of analysis to understand and confirm, do we have sufficient resources? Do we have sufficient transmission to meet the demands that we're forecasting? That information then feeds into our comprehensive reliability plan. If we find that we do not have sufficient resources or do not have sufficient transmission to serve the forecasted demand of the grid, well, then we have to act on that. We would be seeking solutions. We would be working through with developers, evaluating their solutions, and ultimately identifying what's the most efficient or cost-effective solution for the grid in order to maintain that reliability. And that all gets documented within the comprehensive reliability plan. For the cycle we're in right now, I'm happy to say that through a number of changes between updates to our demand forecast, updates to transmission plans on the system, that even though we originally found and identified reliability needs in the assessment last year, we do not need to pursue anything to fill those gaps for the reliability needs. So we will move forward with our comprehensive reliability plan this year. It'll be published at the end of this year. And what that will summarize is really what it sounds like: 10 years worth of plans, both in terms of resources and transmission, and what our vision is for how to maintain reliability over that 10-year period.
I think it's so interesting to me that all of this work that you and your group are doing on a day-to-day basis. It is a guide for the marketplace, technology developers, and policymakers. Zach, we're not possibly going to be able to cover everything that we want to today, so I'd like to have you back before I cover other things. Know that you're busy. We appreciate you taking time that you have today. We got to have you back to cover some more areas. We know our listeners are looking for that. So thank you for joining us today, and we can't wait to have you back again.
Happy to do it, Kevin, and look forward to being back. Thanks again.
Our pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.